The Copenhagen Climate Conference is roughly halfway through, and all the usual anxieties are coming to the fore, particularly in this second week when we are supposed to be heading towards the negotiations leading to a final text. To discuss the various issues facing us at the Copenhagen conference, we have with us today Dr. R. Ramachandran, Associate Editor, Frontline. We are roughly halfway through at Copenhagen, and so far signals seem to be that we have not progressed much beyond what was there before the Copenhagen conference, with the developed countries in particular sticking to their rather tepid targets. In light of that, how do you see the second week going?
In fact, things have progressed somewhat, deteriorated a little bit more than what was evident before the conference began. For example, countries like Japan, Russia and Australia have begun to say that whatever they have offered on the table has nothing to do with the KP track at all. It is to do with the long-term cooperative action track and not the other track, which means they started out with the premise that the KP is not going to exist. So in that sense, I think KP is more or less being sort of buried, given in fact a very bad burial in this sense. Now everybody is only talking, including our own ministers, only talking of the long-term cooperation track and not what is to be expected out of the KP track of setting very hard and deep cuts for the developed countries.
To make things clear for our viewers, the discussions at Copenhagen now are supposed to be following two tracks, with negotiating texts being prepared by two working groups. The first is to fix targets under the Kyoto Protocol for the developed countries, while the second one is to discuss and develop a strategy for long-term action. And as you've just pointed out, most of the focus, including of our minister, seems to be on the long-term action, while nobody seems to be saying anything about what the developed countries are supposed to be doing under the Kyoto Protocol. Given this, and given the developed countries essentially arguing for an abandonment of the Kyoto Protocol itself, but at the same time there is enormous pressure from the African countries, from the least developed countries, from the island states. Do you think that this pressure will suffice to keep the Kyoto Protocol alive, or will it be kept alive just in name?
See, technically speaking, of course, the KP cannot be sort of abandoned totally, because it follows from the Berlin Mandate. So there is under the Vienna Convention, unless you actually take a decision as to formally abandon it, the KP Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol will remain as a kind of a treaty which is in abeyance. That kind of scenario is quite likely. And now everybody, including the small island states and so on, are now talking of Kyoto Protocol plus a parallel protocol, what is known as Copenhagen Accord or whatever we want to call it. So in a sense, what appears to me is that no decision on the Kyoto targets will, for the second commitment period, is likely to happen. Some kind of a decision, some kind of a series of decisions will happen for the parallel accord which is being mooted right now. Now even our minister has said that the chances of a legally binding treaty emerging out of this conference is practically nil, and so what the ministers are going to be there are to sort of sign on a set of decisions which is being called as a political declaration or whatever it is, and work towards a probable treaty. What the treaty is going to be next year is not at all clear. Work towards a treaty next year, probably in December 2010 at Mexico.
It took the world almost 15 years to arrive at the Kyoto Protocol, the first climate treaty. If that treaty is abandoned now, for the sake of a hitherto undefined and elusive new treaty, it looks to me as if the treaty itself will take a large number of years to actualize. Until then, we will only continue with ad hoc measures which are unaccountable to anybody.
Yeah, which is what the developed countries have been arguing for right from Bali Action Plan days itself, which was the In fact, the US mooted that idea of pledge and review kind of system at the time of the Bali conference, that individual actions subject to international review mechanism would be the kind of approach that all countries should take, and this should be applicable to across the board to all countries and all parties of the conference. So clearly we are not looking at the kind of solution that science demands today. In terms of deep cuts by countries which have been responsible for creating this condition of climate change today that we have with us. And everybody is to sort of voluntarily set its own targets and
Hope for the best.
Hope for the best, and what kind of mechanism of review and monitoring is going to be put in place is also not clear.
Right.
And everybody is going to be bound only by the domestic laws, which could be arbitrary in the sense.
Is there a drift towards substituting the Kyoto Protocol by an accord centered around the long-term cooperative action, which would substitute for the first? Because without that, there would be total vacuum, as you said.
The entire effort of the developed countries have been to sort of merge the two tracks together into a kind of pledge and review system under the second track, and they abandon totally the idea of setting targets for the developed countries of deep emission cuts and enforce or take the Kyoto Protocol forward into a second commitment period. So in that sense, it does appear that the second track is the one which is going to stay with us, and also in a not kind of internationally binding kind of mechanism. It's going to be...
well, there's nothing binding about the long-term cooperative action in any case.
Yeah, that's
it's mostly voluntary.
Right, voluntary kind of action.
The draft by China, along with South Africa, India and others, the so-called basic text, when that was released, there was also accompanied statements by China, by India, that if a good deal doesn't come out of Copenhagen, we are prepared to walk out. In the absence of an agreement on the Kyoto Protocol, is there a sign that the Copenhagen talks may actually collapse?
Well, it appears to me that those signs of the whole thing collapsing in some form, in the sense that people walking out of the conference itself doesn't seem to be there. But there's some kind of acquiescence in terms of being resigning to the idea that we'll accept a political declaration and hope for the best in 2010 for some kind of international treaty emerging.
That's right. This momentum that was building up of various heads of state and heads of government gathering at Copenhagen is itself a kind of a guarantee against any collapse or a walkout.
Exactly. That the minister has already said so, that the minister and the heads of states are not here for negotiating, but they are here to sign a political declaration. That he is saying even before what the decisions are going to be within that political declaration, not clear at all. Before that, you are committing yourself to actually signing a political declaration. I think that is a bit unwarranted.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the minister has been, of course, saying this for quite some time. But surprisingly, so has the Secretary of the UN Framework Convention,
Yes.
Ivo Dubois,
Right.
who for the last 6 months has been saying he doesn't expect something concrete to come out of Copenhagen, but maybe something will come out in 2010 and later.
This was very unfortunate that the UN body, which is responsible for providing global action on climate change, is itself resigning to the idea that we are not going to have an international treaty which will fight the causes of climate change itself. It's quite unfortunate that the Secretary should make such a statement.
It now looks as if, from what you said, that we are not going to get a binding treaty coming out of Copenhagen. And if there is no binding targets taken on by the developed countries, one can only imagine emissions continuing to go up. And this is not going to answer to the science. So apart from the clash between the developing countries and the developed countries, this is also in that sense a clash between the future of our planet and those for whom short-term measures are more important.
See, you can see the way things have progressed. You can already see that the developed countries the West is well aware that the impact of climate change is going to be largely on the poor and the developing countries of the South. So they have nothing great, then there are no great stakes for them in actually working towards an international and legally binding treaty.
At least in the short term.
In the short term. So they are resorting to such short-term measures which really do not address the issues of climate change, which will affect the poor countries of the developing world. I mean,
last word on what you think is going to happen in the coming week.
I say, I mean, it's quite apparent that finally some kind of a watered down political declaration will emerge, which all the heads of state will sign. And like in the Bali Action Plan, which I think was a turning point in the entire discourse on climate change, is going to emerge, which is not going to achieve the actual needs of fighting the climate change globally.
On that rather pessimistic note, we will close this discussion. And we will be back next week to review the Copenhagen conference once it is over.